In the last episode of Project Scirocco, I installed all new rear brakes on my 1985 VW Scirocco. New shoes, new springs, new wheel cylinders, new drums, and new wheel bearings. I went through the process step by step so that anyone with a few common hand tools can do the same. Hey, so welcome back to another episode of Project Scirocco, which is the restoration of my 1985 VW Scirocco Mk2. In the last episode, I replaced all of the rear brakes, and in this episode, I wanted to turn my attention to the shocks. Shocks haven't been replaced for an awful long time. I want to get those things out of there, maybe get the springs powder coated, and call the rear end good. Well, turns out maybe I went a little bit farther than that. So let's get into it. Okay, so you guys can see that in a Scirocco, there's the shelves on both sides which have the speakers, and then right over here is the rubber cap that covers the shock, and this is what you need to remove.
Yeah, take the cap off.
I've already sort of peeled this one off, but it's got a rubber lip that goes under this lip right here. Okay, so once you get that rubber boot off, you can take a look at the end of the shock, which is sticking out. It's actually got a notch on both sides and a nut that's right down here. And this is a spacer that needs to come out. So the first thing that you need to do, because it's still attached down below to the rear axle beam trailing arms, is get a crescent wrench, or there are special nuts that you can get to go on top of this, but I just use a crescent wrench. Crescent wrench on the top so that this axle or this shaft doesn't turn. And then there's a nut right down in here, I'll show you a picture in a second, that needs to come off. And then this spacer will come off, this bushing will come off, and then there's actually another bushing underneath here. So here's a closer view. Again, this is the shaft of the shock coming up. Here's this nut that needs to be taken out, and then just get a pair of ice grips or channel locks on top of here so that when you turn this shaft doesn't rotate. Here's an exploded view of the upper part of the rear shock assembly. You can see the rubber cap, the nut that needs to be removed first, a load spreading washer, and the upper and lower rubber bearings. The shock is attached to the body of the car in between the upper and lower bearings, and once the upper nut is removed, the shock should be free to move within the upper mounting cavity. The upper nut is a 17 millimeter, and if my arm was not in the way, you'd see that I used an adjustable wrench to hold the shock shaft steady while I broke the nut free with the wrench. It was a little awkward to get in there, especially since the car was on jack stands, and I had to lean over the hatch opening, but once the nut was free, it was pretty easily removed. Next, the washer just lifts right off, and at this point the shock should be free. And here's some really terrible video of removal of the shock on the passenger side. And once the nut and washer are gone, the bearing just lifts right out. However, you'll notice on this side, whoever did the shocks last time put the bearing in upside down.
That's it. She's loose. Okay, all we got to do is take it loose from the bottom and take it out.
Okay, so the bottom of the shock is attached to the trailing arm by one long 17 millimeter bolt. The service manual shows these should be torqued to 32 foot-pounds, but they came off pretty easily. Definitely a clear benefit of a car with no rust.
Oops. It should be loose. Yeah, it is. It's loose. There it is. Now, how do you get it out of here?
Well, lesson learned. When we removed the lower bolt, the shock fell down into the hole in the trailing arm. While we easily got it out with some minor maneuvering, it might have been easier to lower the axle beam away from the shock, and that's probably what we would do if we had to do it again. Okay, with the shock off the car, the next thing to do was to remove the coil spring. You do this by removing the nut on top of the spacer, which allows you to remove the upper spring retainer. Simple, right?
Well, don't forget, this spring is part of the rear suspension, and it is under compression. Granted, it's not a lot of compression, but it is under compression. Now, I know there are specialty tools that shops have to safely compress the spring, but I obviously don't have one in my garage. And the basic $30 coil spring compressor you can get from Harbor Freight is way too big to use here. So, we employed the jack-in-the-box technique instead.
I knew it was going to do that. All right, do this. This is the bottom. Let's put a piece of tape on the bottom. Okay. All right, we need to set it just like this. All right.
So the bump stop and protective shield are reuse items and must be removed from the old shocks. As you can see, they were not coming off easily, so it was time to use the file strategy. And after a little bit of work, voila, off they came. Okay, so this is what a 36-year-old spring on a Mark II Scirocco looks like. Instead of painting them, I decided to get them powder coated along with the upper spring retainer and the lower spring seat. More on that in the next episode.
So while I was waiting for the parts to come back from the powder coater, I got the bright idea, since the car was already up on jack stands anyway, to remove the rear axle beam. That way I can get in and change all those 35-year-old bushings.
Which meant I had to undo everything I just did in the last video.
Okay, so here I am back where I started last video. Took all the new stuff off, and because what I want to do is remove the rear axle, I had a change of heart. Now that I'm in here, now that the shocks are out, the only thing that's preventing me from taking this out is 2 bolts up here, which you've seen before, on both sides. Lower it down, take this backing plate off, take the actual axles off, and then I'm going to send it out to be blasted and powder coated. That'll also allow me to get into the sway bar and replace the sway bar bushings, as well as the bushings that are back here. Right, so it'll allow me to replace the bushings that are in here, and again, this is only held on with 2 bolts, 1 bolt here and 1 bolt on the other side. There is a brake line, this hard brake line here that comes into the wheel cylinder is a hard brake line that comes into right there, an interface, and that interface is back in here. It's not real easy to see, back in here, and it attaches to a rubber brake line, which then attaches into this interface to the second hard line, which then goes up into the master cylinder, the brake master cylinder. So when we dropped the rear axle the first time, we cut these, and I forgot all about it. And then I was looking in the parts that I bought, and lo and behold, I have brand new rubber brake lines. So they're cut on both sides. So really that axle is ready to come out. All I've got to do is unbolt the 2 bolts holding the axle to the frame. I can probably do that as a job by myself. It's easier if there's somebody to help, but I don't have anybody to help right now. So I'll put the jack down in the middle and make sure that it is supporting the middle of the axle. And after I go on the other side and remove all of the brake hardware I just installed over there, then I think I'll be ready to come over here, unbolt these 2 guys. Yeah, right up in there. 1 and 2, and slowly drop it down by the jack. Right now I've got it supported by some 2x4s, as you can see over there on some ramps as I was working with doing the brakes. But I think I can get this off by itself. There's nothing holding it on besides those 4 bolts and then the brake line, which I had already broke. Okay, before I go to the other side and get ready to take this down, the one thing I do need to do is remove the emergency brake cable from the backing plate, and I don't believe that it's in here. It doesn't look like there's a nut on the other side. Looks like maybe I can just pull that out, and then it follows along the axle, and there is a clip right here which just bends up and bends down, and it's got a little tab here, clip that it's going through. But I think as soon as I drop it from this clip, it should be free. Maybe. I'll have to see what happens. Not sure if it's tied in up here. But in any case, on both sides we've got to remove the emergency brake cable. Okay, so now that I've got this thing free, it looks like this is free, and it is just to pull out. Okay, so there we go. So now there, with the exception of this clip, and I'm wondering if I can pull it out, if there's enough, maybe. I'll see if I can pull that through. All right, and that comes right off, I think. Yes. Okay. All right, there she is.
Great success.
Rear axle, beam, and trailing arms. Managed to get it out without amputating any of my major fingers. Didn't drop anything. Came down pretty easily. Would have been easier job with 2 people, but manageable with 1.
Let's remove that clip.
Which took us back to where we started with that. We said,